This program is made possible by a grant from the Pennsylvania Public Television Network. The network receives funding from the Commonwealth to provide public television for all Pennsylvanians.
For years, they searched for buried treasure beneath a bridge of steel and stone. Legend has it, a bank robber stashed more than $40,000 in currency and gold and never returned to claim it. Yet for all their searching, the greatest treasure of all was right before their eyes. An engineering masterpiece, the Kinzua Viaduct, soared 301 feet high and 2,053 feet across, and was once the highest and longest railroad bridge in the world. Towering above the Kinzua Gorge and surrounded by forest, the viaduct is a symbol of America's ingenuity and determination. Brilliant engineers overcame incredible obstacles to design it. Bold entrepreneurs found the funds to build it, and 100 brave workers, many of them immigrants, completed the job in 94 days. For General Thomas Leeper Kane, a Philadelphia lawyer, decorated Civil War veteran, and president of the New York, Lake Erie, and Western Coal Company, it was a race against time. There were rich coal deposits to the south and a ready market to the north. He had two choices: take an 8-mile detour around the mountains, or shoot straight across with a viaduct, the likes of which no one had ever seen. Thomas Kane had made tough decisions before. In 1850, he refused to enforce the fugitive slave law, resigning his position with the federal courts in Independence Hall. A personal friend of Brigham Young, he defended the Mormon settlers when they were driven out of Ohio and Illinois. Joining them in their exodus west, he prevented an all-out war with government forces by delivering secret dispatches from President James Buchanan. Respected in political and social circles, in 1859, Kane and his wife Elizabeth left their comfortable life in Philadelphia for the wilds of northern Pennsylvania. Thomas became a prominent landholder, built a successful lumbering operation, and cleared the way for the railroads that would deliver lumber and coal to Great Lakes ports. If deep in the forest, it is possible to hear the echo of cannons 800 miles away, then Thomas Kane heard them. The Civil War began at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, and on April 13th, Kane was the first Pennsylvanian to enlist, organizing 300 sharpshooters for his Bucktail Brigade. Kane and his men served at Gettysburg and Chancellorsville before Kane was taken prisoner near Harrisonburg, Virginia. He was released in a prisoner exchange and promoted to Brigadier General by General Ulysses S. Grant. Some said Kane had something to prove. His father, John, had been a powerful judge in Philadelphia. His brother, Elisha Kent Kane, a surgeon in the United States Navy, was a Mexican war hero and famous Arctic explorer. But Thomas was an explorer in his own right. If he could survive his Civil War battles, mediate a resolution to an impending war between the Mormons and the United States government, if he could carve a community out of the toughest terrain in Pennsylvania, surely he could build a bridge.
I think that a lot of the people who came out of the Civil War as leaders, especially those who had gotten battlefield commissions or who had risen up through the ranks during the time of the Civil War, and of course this happened a great deal in that war, those were the sorts of people that you would expect to come back to their local communities and to become leaders after the war. They were people of strong will, they were people of character.
In his business ventures, General Kane surrounded himself with practical thinkers, like Oliver Barnes, chief engineer for the Erie Railway, which ran through the burgeoning Bradford oil regions and Elk County coal fields. Barnes' survey showed the viaduct would save 8 miles of road, avoid 53 feet per mile gradients, and save $30,000. What's more, the railroad could be extended south, cutting the trip from Pittsburgh to Buffalo to 280 miles, and opening up markets for 3 million tons of coal a year. If only they could find a way to build it. Paris-born Octave Chanute, chief engineer for the Erie Railroad relished the challenge. His Hannibal Bridge was the first to cross the Missouri River. His study for the New York Elevated Railway revolutionized mass transportation. A decade later, he would make the leap from railroads to airplanes, sharing his glider designs with the Wright brothers, years before their historic flight. Today, he would listen to the wind rustling through the Kinzua Valley. Today, he would commission a bridge. The contract for the Kinzua Viaduct went to Clark Reeves and Company and the Phoenixville Bridge Works, where German-born Adolphus Ponzano was chief engineer. He would design the wrought iron bridge using the Phoenix column, a breakthrough in engineering that enabled taller, stronger structures to withstand vibration and buckling. When asked if he could tackle a bridge a half-mile long and 300 feet high, Ponzano said, "I'll build you a bridge 1,000 feet tall, if you furnish the money."
I've always kind of gotten a big kick out of thinking about General Kane looking into this big valley and saying, well, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have to build a railroad across this valley, and it's going to require us to build a bridge that's longer and that's higher than any other railroad bridge that's ever been built, but what the heck, let's go for it. And that's that spirit of enterprise. That's that kind of spirit of the age, that real can-do spirit that we often associate with the Gilded Age.
When we started putting our railroads from the eastern seaboard cities to the west, like the Erie Railroad was to link the Hudson River with the Great Lakes, the name of the game was to get the railroad open as quickly as possible. It was called a railroad mania in the 1870s and 1880s. Hundreds of thousands of miles of railroads were built to link up the United States, to knit together the agricultural farms with the larger cities like Chicago and Cleveland and St. Louis and Milwaukee and places like that. And that was the network, the means of getting people and materials moved from one part of the country was via the railroads.
And so it was that the Phoenix Iron Works, a company that began as the nation's first nail factory and made munitions for the Union Army, was now turning out prefabricated iron bridges as fast as their mills could make them. 100 feet of finished bridge for each working day of the year. Inexpensive, mass-produced bridges were sold directly from the company's catalog and made to specification. The company was so busy fabricating bridges in the 1880s, they had little time for George Ferris, who tried to cajole them into building the world's first Ferris wheel for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. A decade later, they would change their mind, erecting their own Phoenix wheel for the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition. As strong and sturdy as the company's railroad bridges, it would entertain thrill seekers from Chautauqua, New York to Los Angeles, California for 86 years. During this unprecedented era of industry and invention, some of the most accomplished engineers in the country were working at Clark Reeves and Company. John Griffin, superintendent of the ironworks, had invented the Griffin gun. David Reeves, the ambitious son of the company's founder, claimed he was a great help to a young French engineer, Gustave Eiffel. And Thomas Curtis Clark, their Harvard-educated senior partner, who had designed the Parliament buildings in Ottawa and the Quincy Bridge over the Mississippi, wrote, "The world of today differs from that of Napoleon more than his world differed from that of Julius Caesar, and this change has chiefly been made by the railroads." True enough, said historian Stephen Ambrose. But it was the American engineers who made it happen, one of whom said, "Where a mule can go, I can make a locomotive go." It was the poetry of engineering, said Ambrose, which required both the imagination to conceive and the skill to execute. And that was nowhere more evident than in America, or in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, where these talented inventors and engineers were finalizing plans for the Kinzua Viaduct.
I've often thought about the characters that worked on the bridge, going through the research necessary for the design, and they were faced with doing something that nobody had ever done before. And so part of this was the practical of getting the train across and the business side of it, but part of it was we're doing this because we can, and to prove that nobody else could do it.
Once the foundation was in place, a crew averaging 125 men completed the bridge in record time. Surface quarries along the sides of the gorge provided sandstone for the masonry piers. Every span had been pre-fitted before leaving the ironworks, so laborers could erect a Clark-Reeves bridge with little supervision and without fitting, filing, or chipping. The men used a traveling crane with 2 steam hoisters and 25 miles of rope to erect the columns and latticework. They were so adept at climbing the diagonal rods and horizontal struts, said Thomas Curtis Clark, that they were like cats running up a tree. No scaffolding was needed, not a single ladder, and none of the men was seriously injured during construction.
These men are nearly all our old bridge erectors. They are satisfied with their pay and not afraid to go up 300 feet. In fact, they wish the structure was twice as high.
3.5 million pounds of iron and $275,000 later, the first steam-powered train rolled across the track, delivering General Kane's coal to market. An ambitious Irishman, proud of his finished work, leaped upon the cowcatcher and won the distinction of being the first man over. Word about the Kinzua Viaduct spread to all corners of the world. Even the French, who dominated civil engineering in Europe, were amazed by its scale. The viaduct stood 24 feet taller than the top of the Brooklyn Bridge above high water.
It became almost immediately a great symbol of achievement. You know, one of the first things that we read about the bridge in the papers of the time is how people started planning excursions out to see it. People came down from Bradford right off the bat to see this bridge and to see what it looked like. And you read about groups planning to have picnics out there. So it's not in the 20th century when it becomes a park that it becomes this great symbol of achievement. It's in the 19th century when it's built and people are talking about it. Let's go see that thing.
It's always been a tourism attraction. Actually, when it was first built in 1882 in the early 1900s, people came from all over to ride the train because it simulated flight. I mean, we take it for granted now that you get in an airplane and you go somewhere. At those times, you know, you walked, you went in a carriage, or if you were lucky enough, you know, later years, you had a little wind-up car. These people, this tracks across the sky, going across this valley in this train excursion was their only experience of flying. And so they would get dressed up and come out in their Sunday best and do this train excursion, and there was a lovely little restaurant on the one side.
The Mechanical Engineering News reported that the passageway on either side, laid with yellow pine and secured by a railing 4 feet high, gives abundant facilities to pedestrians, though it does not ensure their comfort or tranquility of mind. Some, it is said, on reaching the point of highest elevation and looking down, become deathly sick with an inclination to vomit. Others are conscious of an insane impulse to throw themselves over the railing.
Harry Crane of Corry, Pennsylvania, failed to fulfill his published promise to jump from the Kinzua Viaduct Bridge today into the valley 300 feet below, carrying an umbrella as a parachute. He was not even to be found at the bridge.
The few persons who were down there came long distances and hardly expected that the feat would be attempted, but they never had viewed the great bridge and therefore were bound not to make a fruitless trip.
Keepers of eating houses, who were accused by some of getting up a hoax, said they knew nothing of the affair except what they had seen in the papers. No officers were on the spot to interfere had Crane tried the daring venture. A successful accomplishment of this feat is more probable than swimming the rapids at Niagara.
You know, one of my favorite stories is the fact that they used to sell them peanuts to make them thirsty, and then the concessionaire, had lemonade right there to quench that thirst. So you gotta love that even back in the 1900s.
By 1900, powerful locomotive engines and heavy steel cars were taxing the bridge to its limit. Railroad cars had more than doubled their capacity. It was time to replace the old iron viaduct with a stronger one, made of 6.7 million pounds of steel. The Elmira Bridge Company supplied the steel, and Grattan and Jennings, a contractor from Buffalo, built the bridge. It took 120 men working 11 hours a day, just 4 months to finish. Despite forest fires, a visit by a presidential candidate, and labor unrest that hindered their work. With 5 of the towers erected on both sides, 100 riveters and a loftman went out on strike, demanding their wages be raised from 40 cents to 50 cents per hour. Labor was scarce, and the work was dangerous. They were back on the job 8 days later at 45 cents an hour.
Well, before we get too nostalgic about the Gilded Age and all of the great enterprise that was there and all of the great achievements, we have to remember that many of those great achievements were built on the exploitation of labor. A number of people who came to this country during this period, the immigrants, were involved in things in enterprises such as this, building bridges, building railroads, various other kinds of industrial activity, and they were not paid overly well.
I would have bet you a dime to a dollar they would be Irish, they would be immigrants. The Irish built the Erie Canal, which would have been the predecessor of the Erie Railroad. These were men who were eking out a living. These were men who built the United States that, originally built the canals, and then when the canals were made redundant by the railroads, they moved on to build the railroads, and when the railroads were made redundant by the highways, they moved on to build the highways.
In the 1900s, necessity was the mother of invention, and the bridge builders found ways to replace the old with the new. 2 timber travelers worked toward the center of the Kinzua Viaduct, demolishing the old iron towers one at a time, as the new steel ones were hoisted in place. All connections were riveted, ensuring the structure was stronger and more rigid than its predecessor. By the time they were through, they had pumped 37 miles of rivet rod, or nearly 895,000 rivets. The new bridge was a radical departure from standard engineering practices. The bold design enabled the bridge to withstand stresses without the need for diagonal braces. The idea raised a few eyebrows, but bridge designer C.R. Grimm stood by his calculations. He knew that by strengthening the towers with steel plates, the viaduct could last 100 years or more.
When we did our structural analysis using modern computer programs, we found that the calculations they did back in 1900 came within 5% of our computer calculations, which was remarkable.
Grimm's innovations would weather the test of time. But the 1882 anchor bolts, buried deep in the sandstone piers, would not. Ironically, in his rebuttal to a critic, Grimm expressed regret over not replacing the original anchor bolts. Stronger bolts should have been used with superior details and therefore much greater efficiency. His decision would have devastating consequences. In the late 19th century, and for the greater part of the 20th century, freight trains loaded with coal, lumber, and oil, and excursion trains brimming with sightseers rolled across the Kinzua Viaduct. The bridge stood almost as tall as the Statue of Liberty and welcomed engineers and visitors from all over the world. One of the most recognizable landmarks in Pennsylvania. Since 1963, it has been the centerpiece of Kinzua Bridge State Park. Acknowledged for its importance in America's architectural and engineering history, the viaduct is both a national civil engineering landmark and a national historic site. But on July 21st, 2003, the unthinkable happened. A $12 million emergency repair project was well underway after an inspection deemed the bridge unsafe. Engineers had spent months poring over the original engineering drawings housed at the Smithsonian. They devised an emergency repair plan that would preserve the landmark bridge after 40 years of neglect. And thanks to a tenacious crew, work was proceeding ahead of schedule. The restoration project offered visitors a rare glimpse of what it must have been like more than 100 years ago when brave men scaled tall towers to build and maintain the nation's railroad bridges. Founded in 1887, the W.M. Broad Company was blending time-honored techniques with the latest construction technology to assure the structure's authenticity.
You have to keep in mind that those people were like Wilson Monroe, who started this company, and those people knew nothing but work and hard work, and this is definitely hard work, and it was a challenge, but it was also a job. And if you would tell me today that I could take 100 to 150 guys and build this bridge, in 100 days. I'd tell you you're crazy. There's just no way. And that shows you the work ethic that the people like my great-great-grandfather who started this company have.
Soon the contractor would face its toughest challenge yet. The workers decided to call it a day when the sky went dark and the winds rushed in.
An intense system of severe weather is moving into Pennsylvania from Ohio along a north by northwest track at about 50 miles an hour, producing spiral bands of thunderstorms. At the rate these clouds are moving, there's the potential for serious damage. We have a large mesocyclone in progress over north-central Pennsylvania. The counterclockwise rotation inside the thunderstorm measures 2.5 to 3.1 miles in diameter and extends from near the ground to an altitude of 3.1 miles, causing violent winds and heavy precipitation.
A tornado smashed through the forest, heading straight for the viaduct. In 30 seconds, hundreds of trees were ripped from the roots, and 11 of the Kinzu's 20 majestic towers lay twisted on the valley floor. Engineers later confirmed winds quickly gaining in speed attacked the bridge from 3 different directions, lifting the towers from their foundation. The original 1882 anchor bolt system, deteriorating deep within the masonry piers, had finally met its match. A tornado packing 100-mile-an-hour winds doesn't give a whit about time, place, or good intentions. When the rain stops and the fog clears, you can only stand and look at the pieces.
In the business we're in parks and forestry, we deal with a lot of storm events, primarily flooding events. So I'm used to seeing the effects of a flood. I'm not used to seeing the effects of a tornado. And riding into this area, I was amazed, dumbfounded, in awe of what nature can do with all of its force.
I arrived at the site around 8:30 and came right here, and it was, of course, getting dark and was very dusky. And if you've ever been in the mountains after a heavy rain, the mist was settled in the trees in the valleys, and as I walked up here, it had a really eerie looking feeling, and you looked over and it just looked like a war scene with the remnants of bomb smoke.
Some morning it would be like Ireland, the misty, hardly be able to see in front of yourself. Some days it would be cold and ominous looking. The bridge and the valley presented itself differently every day, every time I walked across it. And I told my son, I said, I think that the biggest thing I'm going to miss is just being able to come out here and attend these meetings and walk across that bridge, because it was one of the most peaceful things that I've ever done.
I think of a huge feeling of disbelief that a structure that had stood and withstood time and numerous catastrophes at the point of being saved could fall. And I think just that feeling of shock and disbelief, and just how could this happen when we were this close, just this close to saving it for the next generation.
We've got these wonderful engineered structures out there that are every much as important as, Independence Hall, the nation's capital, the White House, Mount Vernon. But along with, what I call the obvious icons of American history, you have this wonderful legacy of engineered structure, like the Kinzua Viaduct, like the Brooklyn Bridge, like the hundreds of metal trusses and concrete arches that got you from your farm place to the marketplace to the larger city. You can go to Disneyland and places like that, but when you go to places like Disneyland, you're seeing the facsimile, you're seeing something that's been replicated. When you actually go to a site structure object that's been there since 1900, like the Kinzua Viaduct, and can see it and can walk out on it and feel it work, with the wind coming up the valley and the viaduct shifting, and you wonder how in the world has this stood for 102 years.
Kinzua hangs between the mountains like a frozen echo. Parallels converge, the bridge dissolves in light. Below, the stream flows motionless as paint. The distance smudges trees to smears of green. Kinzua hums, the wind's thin fingers strumming steel. Kinzua sings. The locomotive ghosts drum thunder from the crosstide keys. The coal car conga shakes the gorge. The cold, dark sparkle of coal dust falls like snow forever.
Major funding for Tracks Across the Sky is provided by the Pennsylvania Tourism Office, LEDA funding from the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. Tracks Across the Sky is available on VHS or DVD for $19.95 plus shipping and handling. To order your copy, call toll-free 1-800-770-2111 or order online at www.mediasales.psu.edu. This program is made possible by a grant from the Pennsylvania Public Television Network. The network receives funding from the Commonwealth to provide public television for all Pennsylvanians.